The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Vowing to get Canada moving again is one of Prime Minister Mark Carney's promises, a promise he reiterated while introducing his new cabinet. As the economy has taken a jolt from the shifting relationship with the United States, politicians across the country have turned their attention to improving the regulatory environment here at home. Krystal Wittevrongel of the Montreal Economic Institute points out this is an interesting development from the Carney government. She says reducing regulation was supposed to be a priority way back in 2018. Unfortunately, even though it was stated, that government failed to actually make it a priority, and businesses have suffered as a result. Recognizing the negative impacts, she says, is only the first step. What's less clear is how and when the government will actually address the complex issues that are clogging trade in Canada and hampering businesses. I invited Krystal Wittevrongel to join me for a conversation that matters about unclogging the gears of regulation that have bogged down Canadian businesses. Krystal, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, it's been described to me a little bit that when we take a look at the regulatory environment in Canada from government to business, it's as though the gears are clogged with sand. And everything, it's one little bit here, one little bit there, and they accumulate over time and everything has just kind of ground down. Is that a good metaphor?
I love it. I think it's great. When we look at the number of regulations at the federal level, between 2006 and 2021, that jumped by 37%. So this is just a pile up, a pile up, a pile up. And I like the way that you phrased it being sort of a clogging up, because things do move slower. We've seen this in the economy. GDP growth has decreased by 1.7%. Employment growth has also decreased, and so has labor productivity. So this slogging through the regulatory environment, or clogging it up, has real impacts for our economy that we are definitely seeing finally play out in front of our eyes.
You mentioned that the number of regulations has jumped by 37%. And that's not just like one big mass. It's like one after another after another. Why did we become so obsessed with like fine-tuning every regulation that we got to the point where we started to grind the process of doing business down so much that it's now having these negative impacts?
Well, it's not just that they're being added and accumulated, it's that they're not being reviewed or removed either. And that's something that we really, so at the MEI, should be a priority for this new government, is to really look at the current and new and existing regulations and ask some really pointed questions about their use and whether or not they're actually necessary. Some argue that, it's a very complex world. We need more regulations. And, I argue the opposite. Yes, it is a complex world, but more does not mean better. We just need to make sure that things are more targeted and actually having the outcomes that are intended, and not, some of these unintended consequences that we see playing out with some of these regulations.
Do you believe, like you were saying, that there are some people who argue that there should be more regulation, not less? Do you believe that's because those are the kinds of people who say, I can't trust you to make appropriate decisions or choices, and so therefore I'm going to restrict your ability to do that?
That's a great question, and I don't know why they would argue that, other than simply they think perhaps regulation is a good thing. And we see governments, both at the federal level and at the provincial and territorial levels, all having these red tape initiatives or peeling back red tape, or starting to look at and address these these regulatory requirements. So there is an acknowledgement that it is out of hand, but in terms of why somebody would think, just slathering on more is better, I don't quite get that line of thinking personally.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Well, I tend to believe that we have so wholeheartedly adopted the precautionary principle in Canada, and that is that unless it's perfect, uh, we won't, aim for what is possible. We'll aim for what is safe, and we become so risk adverse that we're saying, nope, not going to let you take a chance, even though it may be the business that's taking the chance.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that when we talk about safety, that in the context of regulation is a bit of a gnarly kind of way to talk about it because safety is always and should always be at the forefront. But
Right.
some of these regulations are just, have these consequences that are quite silly. So, for example, in 2024, the Canadian Border Services had reclassified the way that they consider certain costume material. And so this actually impacted a small Calgary business because it required them to refile all of these old records. It ended up being about $100,000 or some quite a large amount of money for a small company in terms of import duties and all of these consequences that had no, didn't really do anything for the public. This wasn't a safety issue. This was, I don't know why they did it, but it just had these consequences that we don't really think that were intended. But when it comes to, the precautionary principle or safety, I think safety should always be at the forefront, but asking certain questions about regulations, even existing regulations, not necessarily just new ones, is really a necessary way to look at whether or not they're even needed, or if safety is just an argument that's thrown in there and isn't actually part of the equation.
So tell us a little bit more about the report. What inspired you to undertake this, and what were the areas that you dug into?
Yeah, so we did look at, and what really stood out for us was that regulatory accumulation. So that 37% increase over a 15-year period, and just the bogging down of business. Since the year 2000, the number of new business starts in Canada has decreased by more than 50%. So we're seeing less businesses want to even, come into the economy. We're seeing the regulations have the impact of slowing the economy in a number of ways. And there's really no way of managing this, at least one that is shared or seen or seems plausible. And so what we did was we looked at the Chrétien program review from the 1990s, which had the impact of really cutting down spending, unnecessary spending, by asking very pointed questions about programs. And so we recommend that the same thing happen with regulations. So just asking a number of questions, we put forward 6 questions to really get to the root of what this regulation is or does, and is it even needed at all?
So what were those 6 questions? Let's go through them and examine why they're important and how maybe they can help shape the discussions around how do we change the regulatory environment so that there is a greater willingness for people to start companies and to be able to grow their companies.
Yeah, so the first question is relatively simple. It's what is the purpose of this regulation? And, that should be very easily understood and very easily explained. And then does that regulation actually serve the public interest or just a narrow group? Moving forward is the third question, is the federal government intervention actually needed? Is there already a similar thing happening either at a provincial or municipal level? Is the federal government really the best place to put in a regulation like this or to moderate this sort of thing? Then the fourth question is, what is the economic cost of such a regulation? Then is there a less costly or less intrusive way of solving the problem? So less intrusive being, infringing on certain groups or other things, not necessarily just economic. And then the sixth and final question is, does the regulation deliver a net benefit overall? So a cost benefit analysis of the entire thing. And so asking these questions or a version of these questions with regards to each regulation in place or proposed to be in place is a good starting point for realizing which ones may not actually be needed at all.
The first question is, what's the purpose of this regulation? I'd be interested to find what the answer might be, because there's so many different cases. You can't apply one answer to all. But it would be quite fascinating to hear somebody justify a regulation that you go, you do realize that you're just handcuffing me here. You're not improving the quality of my business. You're not making it easier for me to move forward and generate the revenue that generates taxes.
Well, exactly. And I mean, businesses across the country in 2024 collectively spent 768 million hours dealing with regulatory compliance. So that's the equivalent of about 394,000 full-time jobs. So this is a huge, huge issue. And having businesses and employees and, the greater economy have to learn to wade through all of this at all times is really slowing things down.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. How important do you think it is that people in government need to have an appreciation of what business needs to succeed? Because my feeling is there isn't a high level of understanding of the kind of environments that a business needs to succeed, and maybe even less a concern about whether or not or why it's important.
It's a really good question, and I don't really know the answer, but I do think that there needs to be an understanding in government about these impacts, and not just on big business, because it's the little businesses that really bear the brunt in a disproportionate way. So I had mentioned that 768 million hours, but when we look at it at a business by business sort of level, large companies, it costs on average about $1,400 per employee to deal with the regulatory environment and compliance. But when we look at small businesses, that is $10,000, about $10,000 per employee. So the costs are magnified, the impact is magnified. And so in terms of the knowledge or awareness or how to navigate this, I don't have a magic pill that tells me the answer to that or how government should deal with it. But I think there really needs to be this awareness and the impact on small business, because if we see that there are, 50% less businesses entering the market now compared to the year 2000, that's startling. And as a consumer, that's startling for me. So I think we should really kind of think about it a little bit more holistically.
Well, I'll agree with you. When you talk about that there is such a dramatic drop in new business starts since the year 2000, it's been falling ever since about 1960. One of the interesting things about Canada in 1960, on a proportion of the population, there were more small business owners on a proportion of the population, as I say, in Canada than there were in the United States. It's not the case today. Canadians were really willing to take those kinds of risks. And you go back to the 1960s, the government sat down and said, what do we need to do to create an environment that makes starting a small business one that we hope will grow, create jobs, contribute to the economy and to the communities that they live in. And they went out and built a strategy that really supported small business. But that adherence or buying into that concept has all but vanished. And I think that the high point of concern for small business owners or anybody considering it was back when Bill Morneau was finance minister, and he said, small businesses aren't paying their fair share of taxes, even though it was a Liberal government that set up the tax environment that said, we understand you're taking a risk. And that you should be able to benefit and realize some of the returns on that risk without being unreasonably penalized. And then when you took a look at what Finance Minister Freeland was proposing, but they've scaled back, it's almost like, well, why bother building a business if when I sell it, the government takes 65% of it? And so These are the kinds of rules and regulations that really get in the way of supporting small business. I'm going to get to my question here, which a long preamble, sorry about that. But it's, people think, oh, well, this is business, these are the people who work. But they don't realize that the business gives the jobs to the people who work. And businesses, when there's uncertainty or so much overhead that's related to regulation, just don't hire people.
Exactly. And that's why with the growth in regulatory requirements, we've seen labor productivity decrease and just, labor in general. And back to what you were saying, I found very interesting about, businesses entering the marketplace and taking risks, is that if the regulatory burden or the number of requirements would have been kept at 2006 levels at the federal level, there would be 10% more business startups in 2021 than there was. So that's a direct relationship there.
Well, there would be more jobs too. I am a small business owner, and with the increase in regulations over the 27 years that I've been in business, I'm more and more reluctant to hire people on permanent full-time employment, because the cost of doing so is so high that it becomes punitive. So who wins here? Nobody.
Exactly. And then we've got, on top of all the costs that we see, when we look at the consumer side, the consumer is penalized by the lack of access to these new and innovative products, or a greater selection of products from businesses that would be able to provide those goods and services, but instead are kept out of the marketplace. And so we really can, imagine that there would be a larger selection on the consumer level as well.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So it's fundamentally important to us that we unclog some of these gears in Canada, because as we know, our relationship with the United States is changing. And exactly how it's going to shake out, nobody knows for sure right now, but it is changing. The good side of all of this is that President Donald Trump has woken up a sense of nationalism here in Canada, and we're saying, elbows up, like we're going to go and we're going to revitalize or invigorate our own economy. That's a good thing. But how are we going to do it? And I note that the federal government as well as provincial governments go, yeah, we're going to get down to brass tacks and eliminate some of these interprovincial trade barriers. Well, as you pointed out in your report, it's great to acknowledge that, but then how do you go about doing that? I'm at a loss.
Yeah, so interprovincial trade barriers are something that we at the MEI have been talking about for years. And when it was brought, to the forefront of public discussion with the tariff discussion in the United States, we celebrated this because this is something we think that people should be talking about. And we've always thought it's so startling that it's sometimes easier to trade with other countries than it is between provinces. And so we've really been advocating for reducing interprovincial trade barriers for years. And some of our work has shown that there would be massive GDP increases and quality of life increases for provinces who were to, reduce their interprovincial trade barriers, even alone in the absence of other provinces doing so. But there is reluctance, and it is a little bit more difficult. And so this reinvigoration of the discussion, it's great, and it kind of is needed considering that the Canadian Free Trade Agreement was back in 2017. But moving forward, it's been a little slower. We've seen some provinces take some initiative, which has been great, and hopeful that we can anticipate more of this in the future. But the barriers are tough. They're tough to quantify. There's different types of barriers. Regulatory is by far the most difficult of the types of barriers to kind of quantify as well.
Yeah. There may be a product that I want to buy from Prince Edward Island here in British Columbia, but I can't get it any other way. Thankfully now we have the internet and I can find it and they can ship it to me. But then that drives up the cost, not only of the product, but also the process of getting it. I can't go to the store shelf, I have to order it and it will come to me. But one of the rules and regulations, it may just be about labeling. And the company, the small company goes, I can't afford to produce 2 or 3 different types of labels. We're too small. If we can start to address those kinds of issues, just small things like that can start to make a difference.
Absolutely. And an example we like to give is related to trucking and logistics. And so when products are shipped across the country between provinces, there are often different standards for the trucking requirements between those provinces. So that adds to the time it takes to ship these products. That adds to the cost for both the producer and the consumer. And that just really is an unnecessary thing for, businesses to have to deal with when it's something, like different types of tire sizes, for instance, that are required in one province versus the other. So that's the regulatory side of things, but provinces have been really moving on the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, the exceptions that they list to free trade within that, and have been slowly chipping away at that, as has the federal government. But the regulatory side, hopefully we'll see more movement towards sort of harmonizing some of that. That's, as you say, things like labeling. There has been a lot of work done on like building codes and that sort of thing, because it is amazing the amount of difference and chaos that different codes and building things like that can really throw into an operation.
Well, just sort of on the last thought that you bring up building codes. Many years ago, I did a whole series about the leaky condo situation in Vancouver. And one of the contributing factors to it was that there was a national building code that new home construction, condos and so on, needed to have a building wrap. And that building wrap in extremely cold climates is a great idea. In an extremely wet climate like British Columbia, it wasn't a good idea because the building couldn't breathe. It couldn't dry out. Water gets in, couldn't dry out, became a horrible rotting issue. And that's just one example of a national standard that's applied ubiquitously when it really needs to be specific. And as you pointed out earlier, provincial regulations were probably the better way to go.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the thing, is when it comes to trade, it is primarily at the provincial level where these regulations come into play, or where the exceptions to free trade within the Canadian Free Trade Agreement actually lies. So it's really, the ball's in the court most of the time with the province themselves to actually make movement and work towards cutting down on the interprovincial trade barriers. And some provinces have, like Alberta has really done a lot towards this. Ontario, Nova Scotia, we're seeing a lot of movement there. We can only, wait and hope that it unfolds in a way that is productive and efficient.
Well, here's hoping. Thank you for your time today, Krystal.
Thank you for having me.